Welcome to the 3-block model of UDL video series. This series is being shot on the traditional and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I want to extend my deep gratitude for their willingness to share the land. There is a grace being extended to me as a settler and to other settlers living on this land that was not extended by settlers to Indigenous peoples. And I want to recognize and respect that grace and thank you for showing us the way. So who am I? My name is Dr. Jennifer Cates. I was born in Winnipeg and spent my first few years teaching in Winnipeg before moving to Vancouver. I taught in a suburb of Vancouver called Richmond for 16 years. And then when my mother became ill, moved back to Winnipeg to be closer to her and became a professor at the University of Manitoba, where I spent 7 years working with schools, school districts, and teachers to move inclusive education and universal design for learning as a framework for inclusive education forward. In 2016, I returned to Vancouver and assumed the position I am now in as an associate professor in the Supporting Inclusive Education concentration at UBC. Over my more than 20 years in K-12 education and 30 years in K to post-tech, I have taught many different grades, many different subjects. I've been a classroom teacher, I've been a resource teacher, I've been a guidance counselor, I've been an educational assistant, I've been a district consultant. I've worn many hats, in other words, and taught many grades. All of that experience contributes to what I am sharing in this video series. It is 30 years worth of involvement in the education field and experience in working across provinces and across countries. I've worked in the United States, in Europe, in a number of different countries to move inclusive education forward. I want to start for a moment, just taking a moment for us as a profession to reflect on our path. We started off as exclusionary, right? Kids with disabilities or diverse needs in whatever ways did not attend schools. Then we moved into segregation, where we recognized the need to educate all, but we educated students with disabilities and other differences in separate settings, whether that was special schools or special classrooms, or in fact in hospitals. We then moved into integration that kind of had two phases. The first phase was we built special ed classrooms in regular schools so that at least the students were in schools, not hospitals, and had access to things like libraries and playgrounds, but they were still separated from their neurotypical peers. The second stage of integration began when we began to take students from those special education classrooms part-time into general education classrooms for specific subjects or specific topics, part-time. But their home base, they were still registered in a special education program. As we moved towards inclusion, we began to enroll all students in general education classrooms. So all students had physical placement in general education classrooms. However, often this ended up looking not too dissimilar from integration, because the students with diversities or differences were often being taught separately. They were doing a separate activity from the rest of the class, often at the back of the room with an educational assistant or a resource teacher. They were not truly learning in interaction with their peers. They were not truly a part of the learning and the life of the classroom. As we took our next step towards teaching to diversity, we began to recognize that in fact, all children are diverse. It is not just about students with disabilities. Every child is unique in their background knowledge, in their life experiences, in their interests, in their ways of learning. Neurocognitively, if we were to measure your working memory and your attention and your language processing and all of those things, we would all have a bar graph profile. We are all unique and different. The world functions on chaos theory. It functions on the idea that that diversity is what makes our world work. It's what makes our communities work. We require that biodiversity. And that is true in our classrooms too. We learn by interacting with diverse others. Critical thinking is developed when I hear a different perspective from my own and have to then decide whether that changes my thinking or whether I can justify my thinking. We require that diversity. And by learning and living together, by growing up together, we learn how to live and work together in the adult world as well. Teaching to diversity is the stage that many of us have been working towards for many years now, towards recognizing the diversity of all of our learners and towards designing for that diversity. But I want us to have an even deeper vision. If we were to move forward from here, where would it go? To me, I see two future stages of this. There's probably more, but here's where we are in my vision right now. One is that I believe inclusion actually is going to have to require us to remove some of the boundaries that we currently have. We currently expect students to still fit into this circle we call the classroom, the school, the education system, etc. And it has some boundaries that do not truly allow all students to become who they are meant to be, to maximize their gifts and the meaning and the purpose of their lives. And I think we're going to have to remove some of those boundaries. That's not to say we have to blow up the system, but rather that we have to open the system to provide choices to our students in terms of where they go and how they learn, and building in more of that self-regulation in terms of students discovering their gifts, deciding to actualize those gifts, and finding meaning and purpose in their lives. Ultimately, that leads us to ensouling our schools. It leads us to bringing soul, which means to bringing meaning and purpose to our lives, to our schools, to our students' experiences in our system. It means helping all of the students see their place in the world, recognizing they are a part of something much larger than themselves, and yet an important part of that larger system that we call the human race, that we call our planet, right? All living things. That ultimately has to be our vision. And as we move through this series, we will talk about teaching to diversity, some of the flexibility that we might need to truly make that inclusive, and ultimately, what does it mean to ensoul our schools, to really create schools in which spirit, and I don't mean religion, although religion may be one path to that, but in which our spirits are actualized, who we are meant to become becomes actualized, both for our students and for all of the adults who's made their lives out of doing this work. Again, just to be clear, the first step in this is the acceptance of that idea that all of us are diverse, that in fact, nobody is all black or all white or all red or all yellow, regardless of what those colors might mean to you in any particular category, culture, faith, sexual orientation, etc. But in fact, that all of us are a mishmash of colors, right? We all have diverse profiles and have elements of I am both a daughter and a sister and an aunt and a Jew and a Canadian and heterosexual and, right? I can do a million ands. We have many identities and many aspects to who we are. Ultimately, if we're going to talk about truly embodying all the talk about equity and diversity and justice and inclusion, we're going to have to accept all of these pieces. That equity doesn't mean equal. Our kids don't all need the same thing. That inclusion really means having no exclusion. It really means understanding that everybody matters and everybody is related and everybody has a purpose to being here. It means recognizing that diversity is something that we need, we require. Biodiversity is required, and so is intellectual diversity, and so is a diversity of experience as we grow to turn us into our best selves. Ultimately, if we talk about justice from an educational standpoint, from an inclusive education standpoint, justice becomes about the removal of systemic barriers. Yes, racial privilege. Yes, socioeconomic privilege.
There are
But
so many different forms of bias. It can feel overwhelming. And the truth is, we all carry bias. We all were raised with certain beliefs and surrounded by certain people. And so it's not about denying the existence of any of these things, but rather about constantly reflecting on where we are in our own journey with them and how we can move beyond them as we engage with diverse others. The reality is this: systems are created by people in power, and they're created for people like them. That doesn't mean it's malicious. We think if it worked for me, it'll work for them, right? It's a natural process that if you've been successful, you become a teacher, then you teach the way you were taught because it feels like it worked for you. So this isn't about being malicious or deliberate in our bias or in our systematic racism. Not to say there isn't some people who are deliberate about it, but the vast majority of us, it's just that this is what we know. And what has to happen for us then is the willingness, the openness to hearing, this doesn't work for me. I need something different. Here's how I learn. Here's what makes me feel safe, comfortable, good about myself, connected, etc. It's about being open. The reality right now is that our school system reflects white middle-class Christian values, that written is valued over other forms of communication. How many times have I heard elementary school teachers say, well, you can draw if you finished your writing? What does that say to the kid whose best way of representing their understanding is visual, who might one day be an architect or a graphic designer? But in our classrooms, that's not valued the way the written word is. We refer to Western civilization and to other countries as primitive or third world or all of those kinds of terms. We refer to the Bible as fact versus myths and legends of other cultures' ideas about how the world was created and so forth. We define respect as deference. Respect means being quiet, respect means listening, respect means all of those kinds of things. But go into other cultures and respect means debating, respect means engaging, respect means being openly emotional. We value independence over interdependence. We value facts and truths rather than debate and ambiguity. So there's many different aspects to this, right? And it is about, we've recreated a system that worked for the people who then become the teachers and the educators and the principals who create the system. And so the cycle continues. In order to overcome biases then, we have to be open, as I said, in our interactions with others and working on the judgments we have of people, in the way that we create rules in our school and classroom culture, Rules are often based on white middle class values. As I said, what is deemed respectful behavior or deemed responsible behavior is our idea of what respect looks like. But in another culture, children aren't supposed to make eye contact with an adult. In another culture, children are supposed to debate the teacher. So there's many different, we need to be aware that the community around us might have different ideas about what being responsible means. Maybe responsible means looking after their younger siblings, not doing their homework, right? So all of those kinds of pieces. And also in our instructional materials, representation matters. When kids only see white middle class people in the history we teach them, in the cultural studies that we do, in all of those things, there's a message in that. So finding representation in the literature we use in our classrooms, in the histories and the geographies, and even the science and the math. There is math algorithms created by Egyptians and others by Greeks and others by others. Have we looked at all of those different kinds of pieces to show kids the contributions of all these different cultures and peoples? Ultimately, here's the big question. Can we shift away from looking at the negatives to celebrating the positives? That doesn't mean, oh, I don't see color, right? It's not about denying race. It's not about denying faith or culture or gender or sexual orientation or any of those things. It's about seeing it and celebrating it. It's about saying, what do people from that culture, what have they contributed to our world? What have I gained in my own life because I've interacted with such people? With young kids, it can be as simple as things like cuisine, right? Pizza comes from Italy and Chinese food and all of these things we wouldn't have if we lived in a unicultural world. So getting kids to see that we've all gained, and I'm being very simplistic talking about food, but my point here is that can we find what has been given to us from the diversity of people that we live with and go to school with? What is the richness of that race, culture, faith, gender, etc.? And what would be missing if they weren't a part of our lives and our world? So instead of focusing on the negatives, focusing on celebrating the differences, recognizing the differences and celebrating them. I love this graphic, so I just had to share it with you briefly. But this idea of the 5 lessons in life that our kids and us as professionals need to be who we are, need to be allowed to maximize who we are. That it's not about fitting in. It's not about everybody being good at reading and writing and everybody being good at the things we think and who cares about all these other things. It's about, as a teacher, this number 5. Today I shall behave as if this is the day I will be remembered. When your students look back 15 years from now on their experience in your classroom, will you be that teacher who inspired them? Or will you be that teacher that had negative impacts on them? That's really what we're talking about here. We've all seen the diagrams of the children standing on different boxes as marks of equity, that everyone is getting what they need. But what if we just removed the barrier, right? We have a staircase on a building, not everyone can enter. But if we put a ramp on the building, then everybody can enter. So let's take out the staircases. Let's take out the things that prevent some of our students from accessing our schools, our system, our education, from becoming who they have the opportunity to become. Ultimately, I hope that this video series leads us there. Leads us not all the way there. That is a long-term vision, and I recognize that boldly and humbly, but begins to help us to move towards that idea that it is possible. It is possible for me as a teacher and for us as a profession to meet the needs of diverse learners in our classrooms and schools. It is possible to create truly inclusive environments where we celebrate the diversity of our students. Our world does. Our world has places for kids who can't sit still. Our world has places for kids who don't want to read novels and write essays for a living. That same child that we tell to keep their hands to themselves, we then pay to be our massage therapist. The child who couldn't sit still becomes the paramedic or the emergency room nurse who needs to work a 12-hour shift without sitting down. The world celebrates diversity, but our school system does not. And that is where the vision of this video series is embedded in. It is the underlying vision that we come to that place of celebrating diversity to the same extent that our world does. And perhaps even move it a little bit forward. When we talk about the 3-block model of universal design for learning then, and we will talk more about that in a subsequent video, but to give the basic vision of that, we are talking about every single child who lives in the community, attending their community school, being academically included, meaning that they are challenged to learn and grow, and that they have the opportunity to learn with their peers, and that they are socially included, meaning that they have the opportunity to feel good about who they are, to feel that they have something to offer, and to feel connected, that this is their class, their school, that they have friends and they have a relationship with their teacher. Our goal then is academic and social inclusion. Universal design for learning is a framework for helping us achieve that. Our goal is not UDL. Our goal is to ensoul our schools, to make them the most inclusive schools possible. But the how of that lies in universal design for learning. It is the way in which we can create those classrooms and those schools and move our profession forward to that vision. Many of you have seen this graphic of the 3-block model. We will talk more about it in subsequent videos. What matters here is to recognize the 3 main components here of what we're going to try to do in this video series. We're going to talk about our students' social and emotional learning and well-being. We know from neuroscience that children cannot learn if their cortisol levels are too high, that whether or not we believe it's our job to deal with social and emotional learning, we deal with it every minute of every day. And that if we want our students to achieve academically, we're going to have to pay attention to the social and emotional aspects as well. Mental health has become an increasing issue in our schools. And there are ways for us as classroom teachers to build coping skills, to build some of those resiliencies into our students proactively. This isn't about making teachers therapists. It is about helping us to develop our students' ability to cope with the natural stresses of life. And then, of course, there's our instructional practice. How we design the learning in our classrooms impacts our students' social and emotional well-being. They are, in fact, both interactive. And there are the systems and structures. This is the bigger picture of the hiring and the budgeting and the staffing and the policies and the structures that we need to fully embody an inclusive system. As a teacher, I control block 1 and block 2. I close my door and I design the culture and the climate, and I design the instruction in my classroom. Even if block 3 isn't ideally being implemented, I can still control block 1 and block 2. But it supports me as a teacher if we can move the systems and structures forward. And over the course of this series, we will talk about how to fully develop all 3 of these aspects of inclusive education. So in this series, the first 10 videos are designed
to be about the tier one. They are about what does an inclusive classroom and an inclusive school look like? How do we design our instruction? How do we plan our units? How do we assess? How do we grade our students? All of those things that are a part of our lives as teachers. The second set is a set of 6 videos that is about addressing students who require additional supports and how that is done through an inclusive, through a universally designed lens. There are nuances to how we do things when we are looking through that lens as opposed to from a special education medical model lens. So we will talk about that. And the final set of videos is about leadership for inclusion. It is about how we become the leaders who move our systems, our schools, our colleagues forward. I hope these videos are of help to my colleagues on the ground in the field. That is their purpose, and that is my hope.